On today's Critical Take, I want to discuss Nintendo and specifically ask the question, to what degree is Nintendo really an innovative company? Now, the standard narrative around Nintendo is one where it is a company that embraces innovation. It has a constant commitment to innovation, finding new ways for people to play and interact with games, and just a very unique way of generating that specific brand of Nintendo digital fun. And you kind of add to this commitment Nintendo's lauded library of original IPs, and you get the impression that the company is on a nearly 40-year run of can't miss projects. And this is particularly true when you look at their balance sheets over the years. Nintendo is a very profitable company. They are doing something right. But I kind of want to turn that around and really question, to what degree are they just a well-run business, and are they really innovative? So to come up with an answer, I think we need to do two things. We need to now use historical perspective, look at the 35, 40-year run of Nintendo, and use that historical distance to question and to ask the question and to look at the strengths and weaknesses of the company's hardware choices. And related to that, I think we need to kind of decouple games and the IPs that they've developed from the actual hardware and business choices that they've made. And I think also, all too frequently, you have these nostalgia for Nintendo games. And for the act of actually just quote unquote playing Nintendo, these things evoke a nostalgic response in people of a certain age. And I think that clouds our evaluation and judgment of the company's hardware products and strategies. And I'm, of course, right in this demographic. I'm guilty of it myself. I was a Nintendo kid. I grew up playing Nintendo games, owning every piece of Nintendo hardware. And those were some of the most pleasurable experiences of my youth. I still buy each console, I still collect for each console. But I want to step back from that hardwired nostalgia. I want to ask these questions. And I think when you do that, an alternate history of Nintendo reveals itself, and it's a history worth telling. So, to tell this story, I want to begin at the Super Nintendo era, let's say 1985 to 1996. Back when Nintendo was at the height of its powers, having achieved an almost perfect synergy between hardware capability, great games, expansive distribution, and really unrivaled market share and mind share. In the 8-bit and 16-bit era, Nintendo was king. Now, they were the unquestioned king against their 8-bit rivals, and they were, I would argue, fighting champions against the challenges in Japan from the PC Engine and the Genesis here in North America. The move from the 8-bit era to the 16-bit era was smooth. It was seamless. It was innovative. The SNES really took everything that the NES did and made it better. You had better graphics, sound, ergonomics, and better versions of the beloved games that you had on the NES. And this change, this leap, was very striking in its time. I think you can make the same argument in the move from the Game Boy to the GBA. The GBA just did everything that Game Boy did better. Although I do think, to be fair, Game Boy is, for many of us, 30s and 40s, the more nostalgic console. But in the move beyond the NES, Nintendo begins a series of stumbles, I would argue. And these stumbles reveal themselves with the benefit of hindsight, and this is where the alternate history begins. So let's start with the Virtual Boy. This was a console that I owned back in the day, and I would say it is a failed transitional era gimmick console. Now, what do I mean by the transitional era? That move between the 16-bit consoles and the 32-bit consoles, where companies were trying to get into the gaming space. You think about the 3DO, the Jaguar, projects like the Laser Active, and the Virtual Boy kind of fit right in here. Nintendo didn't have the N64 ready to go, but felt they needed to move on from the SNES. And this is what they came up with. I kind of think, looking back, did it need to exist? Even back in its day, it was awkward, it was uncomfortable. And returning to it as an adult, I think it's torturous and nausea inducing. And I kind of remember my parents would play the NES. They might have played the SNES as well, but they kind of threw in the towel after 5 minutes with this new virtual reality machine. And even the strengths of the console, it offered you kind of multi-plane gaming, parallax scrolling, mechanics where you would kind of move in between those planes. Only few games really prominently displayed that capability. And you kind of wonder why Nintendo would risk its reputation by releasing the Virtual Boy so shortly after its monumental successes of the 18, 16-bit era, and so shortly before the N64 was coming out. Why would they attach their name to something like this monochromatic, uncomfortable system? I think in a way, the Virtual Boy was kind of Nintendo's 32X, an add-on that promised a lot but delivered very little. And the only difference being the Virtual Boy didn't actually harm the public perception of Nintendo nearly as much as the 32X did for Sega. But the 32X was very much, again, a transitional project, and it's the N64 that really marks the start of this alternate history. It's the console where a major chink in Nintendo's armor emerges and reveals itself. And I think there are two main issues with the Nintendo 64. You had, on the one hand, the choice of cartridges over CD storage. Going with carts made N64 games more expensive to produce, thus more expensive for consumers. And it was a technology that also severely limited the audio quality of most games, which was a feature of games that was about to take a leap on the PlayStation and the Saturn. Famously, this led certain developers previously loyal to Nintendo, like Squaresoft, to jump ship to Sony. And I remember this jump having a major effect on me back when these consoles released. I remember seeing some of the devs and the third-party developers that I loved on the SNES moving to Sony, and that became the Sony PlayStation became the console that I needed to have. The N64 became my secondary choice, something that I purchased maybe a year and a half later. And I think this started Nintendo down the path of becoming that other console, that secondary console, maybe that you buy for the kids because it has some great IPs, but it's not the one that's going to dominate the majority of your gaming time. Then you come to the controller. And back in the day, the controller was new, it was quirky, but even then I felt like the analog stick was cheap and prone to breaking with vigorous use. It had those two main methods of holding it and controlling games, but the PS1 controller felt more familiar, it felt more comfortable, and when the DualShock came out, that felt like it was an analog stick done right. And of course, as time moves on, here's where hindsight is coming in. As time moves on, the N64 controller, I think, has aged horribly. It makes returning to the N64 a chore unless you have a decent third-party pad with a tight analog mechanism. And I've experimented with a couple of them, and they're better, but it still doesn't feel great. And looking back, I think the choice of the controller is the beginning of one of the key patterns that Nintendo employed with each console generation, and that's the use of strange and gimmicky control schemes to mask a lack of actual innovation on the hardware level. So, in the case of the Nintendo 64 and consoles and controllers that were to follow, the control schemes force a psychological and motor skill adaptation on the part of the player, and this deflects attention away from hardware level shortcomings. When you add Nintendo's truly great games into the mix, this is kind of a grand distraction that only deepens. As you focused on playing these great games and mastering these new input methods, you didn't really have time to notice the problems. So when you were playing Mario 64, even if the stick didn't feel great, um, holding the controller, the Z triggers, things like that, it was new, it was different, and it moved your focus away, I think, from the compromised audio. Now, Mario 64 is a great game. It's an all-time classic. I'm not saying it's a bad game because of the control scheme, but I think if you follow this thread of control gimmicks, it plays out in every subsequent generation. And so with the N64, I've always wondered why Nintendo just didn't bite the bullet and go the CD route. It would seem that games on the N64, if they were on CD, maybe even with or without a better controller, would have been the best versions. They would have been cheaper, they would have had better music. By extension, they would have had the ability to retain development partners that Nintendo had on the SNES. And even if Nintendo was too proud to collaborate with Sony and develop that console that they were working on together, if they had come up with their own CD based console, I certainly back in the day would have said, okay, two CD based consoles, Sony's the new kid on the block, Nintendo is the established brand. I would have gone with that. So I think this is Nintendo's first kind of mistake in their history. So now let's move to the GameCube. And with the GameCube, we see another familiar pattern emerging from Nintendo. And this is what I call the Nintendo correction, where the company does in its next gen console what it should have done in the previous generation console. There was nothing fundamentally wrong with the GameCube. In fact, it was more capable than the PS2, which obviously was the most popular console of its generation. The GameCube was essentially what the N64 should have been, a powerful CD based console with, yes, a unique but high quality and more familiar controller. Now, there are two ways to read this. Nintendo, you could say, is correcting a mistake, or you could say that it's learning and advancing a previous design. But I would still ask the question: is this innovation? Is this real innovation? Now, compare the GameCube with its competitors. The PS2 really maintained the strengths of the PS1. Controller was more or less the same. Um, the developers stayed with the PlayStation. And what was new was DVD storage and playback and some early networking capabilities. Then you look at the Xbox that went even further, hard drive based storage and an advanced online service that Nintendo has arguably not rivaled. And then you had the GameCube. It was perfecting its controller. It had optical storage, but it was really left behind by these other technologies. Yes, I realized there were a few games where you had some networking capability, but Nintendo was again, it was correcting its problems with the previous generation while its competitors were innovating and pointing the way forward. And now we come to the Wii. And hey, there's no denying that the Wii was extremely popular. It was a true hit, and the motion based gameplay, the simplified controller, and input schemes made gaming accessible and communal in a way that it arguably hadn't been since the heyday of the NES. And yet by 2009, 2010, I would argue the hype and the popularity began to die down. And what we were left with was a console that was really the embodiment of distraction through gimmickry. The PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 were offering HD visuals and were helping to drive the adoption of HD TVs, where Nintendo was still chugging along at 480p. And if you happen to have had an HD TV when you got the Wii initially, you couldn't help but to notice that the visuals were imprecise and they were kind of muddied, almost obscured, like it had some of the games had a Vaseline smear, that kind of effect. Now, the control scheme, again, initially very innovative, just looked like a regular remote control, but the Wiimote was effective in initially simplifying video game controls, again, to the point that mom, dad, grandma, and grandpa could play the Wii. But over time, they became cumbersome to use, and they weren't just a replacement for sitting on the couch with a traditional controller and playing. And of course, it became expensive. You had to buy the Motion Plus modules for the Wiimotes. You had to buy new Wiimotes with that technology built in, and then you had to buy, connect the external controllers to the Wiimotes. it was a scheme that didn't really feel like innovation. I always felt the Wii had some great games. I just want to plug a controller in and go. And I think the key piece of evidence here that really supports my position is that motion controls never really caught on beyond the Wii. Sure, they still exist. They're used in the Switch. PlayStation 3 had some motion controls built in kind of as an afterthought. Microsoft tried their Kinect out, and then obviously the VR units today use advanced motion tracking. But I think the public never really shifted their preference away from using just a solid, well built traditional controller. And when you combine those two things, the irritations that are involved in the control scheme, plus not to mention calibrating the little plastic motion bar, um, and the fact that you just had subpar visuals for the era, the Wii in hindsight feels very much like a missed opportunity again. Now, the Wii U is interesting in that it combines both distraction through gimmickry and this Nintendo correction. The correction, of course, was giving the Wii platform 1080p visuals 6 years after that technology was cutting edge, and I think that a lot of people wanted to see in the original Wii. And what was even more welcoming was that many Wii U games ran at 1080p 60 and really finally showed off the beauty of Nintendo's art style and their approach to game design. It would have been nice to have that at the beginning of the HD era when you consider that most 360 and PlayStation 3 games ran at 30 FPS, and they had that decidedly gray brown color scheme in a lot of their gritty AAA titles. Now, the gamepad on the Wii U was a definite step up from the Wiimotes as kind of the main control device. And the optional Pro controller was, I think, extremely well built and comfortable, and in my opinion, even better than the current Switch Pro controller. So that was the correction, but at the same time, the system offered distraction through gimmickry with its asymmetric play concept. This idea that the gamepad player and the couch players would play the same game while having different experiences, different objectives in the game, using different control mechanics, and of course, concentrating on different displays. Now, as far as Nintendo's distractions go, this was, I think, actually one of the fairly well executed ones. It was unique and it worked well in some games, including the pack in Nintendo Land game and the Wii Sports U game. But again, it was expensive, it was cumbersome. You needed four more controllers. Now, they did work with the Wii peripherals, so you could do that. You needed to still attach the motion sensor bar to the television, and depending on your AV setup, that wasn't always the easiest thing to do. You had to clear out space in your room, and of course, you needed multiple friends with the time and desire to have an extended play session. And for me, that rarely came together. And judging by how quickly Nintendo dropped this design approach, I think this was likely the case for many people. So, what was Nintendo distracting people from with the Wii U? I mean, in my opinion, it was the fact that their 8th gen console was the console they should have released at the start of the 7th generation. Now, the DS and 3DS handhelds were no strangers to these very established patterns of distraction and correction. You look back to the DS, the control scheme seemed to trade on the popularity of stylus based organizers like the Palm Pilot, which were very popular in the early to mid 2000s. And it was an input method that, again, to me, was more frustrating than just the normal handheld experience that you had on the GBA. I think its best implementation was probably the 3D Picross games. And having that, having to use the stylus kind of went against the casual, relaxed play that the relaxed way that most people wanted to play their handhelds, laying back in bed, relaxing on the couch, playing it for short spurts on public transport. And a lot of times it was just inconvenient to constantly reach for the stylus. It was annoying and it was oftentimes odd looking. Uh, Games on these consoles, I think, were great in spite of the gimmicks, not because of them. And I think having stylus input flat out ruins some games. Like on the DS, the World Ends With You game, which I just recently started playing, and it would have just been better to have a traditional control scheme, because that was a very interesting game. Take the Kid Icarus remake on the 3DS, which required a stand to accommodate its odd control choice, and it made your hands hurt, kind of gave you carpal tunnel if you played it for long enough. I always thought the dual screens on the DS should have been the key feature, and that the stylus was just forced for the sake of seeming high tech in the mid 2000s. Now, interestingly, the 3DS was both a gimmick, or the 3D function on the 3DS. It was both a gimmick and a correction. It was a gimmick upon its initial release in the original model, where I felt it was imprecise. And of course, if you moved your head away from dead center of the screen, you would lose the 3D effect. And again, this is a gimmick that led to frustration. It led to many users simply turning it off. Now, it was corrected very effectively in the new 3DS, which had the eye tracking technology, and it actually allowed you to maintain the 3D image and to appreciate how the 3D functionality added to the art style of some games very powerfully. Mario 3D Land, I think, is one of the best examples of this. And in a certain sense, the eye tracking 3D corrected not only the poor implementation on the original 3DS, but also the painful 3D of the Virtual Boy. And one example I would give you is take the game Kirby Triple Deluxe and compare that to the Virtual Boy Wario Land. And I think you can see in Kirby Triple Deluxe the full design expression of what they were going for on the Virtual Boy. So, for those who watch this channel, I mean, I'm not trying to say that the DS and the 3DS were bad consoles. In fact, I've said on this channel many times before that I think the new 3DS is the best Nintendo console since the NES, and I'll stand by that. And I think one of the reasons for that was, as time went on, developers moved away from forcing the stylus on players, and the eye tracking 3D feature made using 3D less of a distraction. And I think the games were just more focused on being great games. I think the console wound up having tons of variety, lots of unique games, solid JRPG library. You combine that with the great Nintendo exclusives, and you have one of the greatest Nintendo consoles of all time. So now we come to the Nintendo Switch, and a while back I released a critical take called "The Nintendo Switch is a Disappointment." So I'm not going to rehash all the points I made in that video, but my basic argument was that the Switch is a cynical console. It's a console in which Nintendo slowed its release of their own high-quality titles in favor of more or less creating a marketplace for remakes and re-releases of games that are oftentimes cheaper, look better, and play better on competing platforms. Now, the gimmick here was the frequent Nintendo-funded influencer refrain of, "But it's portable, dude," as if paying full price for a gimped version of Doom that ran buttery smooth on the PC for $30 less was somehow a privilege. But that having been said, it was also a correction of the Wii U, in that the range-limited gamepad was now a functional portable console that you could now dock. Of course, it was sleeker, smaller, and you could still theoretically support the multiplayer ambitions of the Wii U, but this time on the go. Nonetheless, I feel like the Switch has been a missed opportunity. I feel like we're still waiting for a lot of the great first-party games that we wanted on Nintendo. Obviously Metroid. I still think an F-Zero, a new F-Zero would be awesome. You can come up with probably 10 other games that you would like to see. So I don't know what the future is. What is next for Nintendo? What other gimmicks and corrections can they offer and still be relevant? And I think their core technology position in 2021 seems more limited than ever compared to Xbox, PlayStation, things that are going on the PC, and just the direction that AAA publishers are taking the gaming industry. I don't see Nintendo having the online infrastructure. I don't see them having a way to compete in cloud computing and things like that in any meaningful way. I mean, you have to think they could do something extreme and different, like transition all of their content to a streaming service, but again, not likely with their famously conservative business strategies, and certainly, again, not without a third party that could provide that technology to them. I know there's always been rumors about an upgraded Switch, maybe one that runs in 4K, and yeah, will it allow them to continue selling high-priced releases and re-releases for the next 5 years? Possibly. Um, but I still think the future is uncertain, even though the Switch was an unquestioned financial success. And it seems like I'm running down Nintendo in this video, and I'm really not. I'm kind of pointing out some uncomfortable truths about their history, but I still love Nintendo as a product, and I don't want to as a company, and I don't want to see them follow these AAA publishers, because I don't think the direction that gaming is going is necessarily positive. So I want to see Nintendo really innovate. I want to see them get out of this cycle of gimmicks and corrections. I want to see them do something truly innovative, and it seems to me maybe their opportunity lies in, like I said, getting out of this cycle, stopping with these incremental corrections, not come up with a console that has some new and different control scheme gimmick, and really use the creativity that they've always had in their game design to challenge what is becoming the status quo of gaming, to give us something other than half-baked, microtransaction-laden AAA experiences that foment FOMO and fizzle out within a year. I think it's time for Nintendo to move away from being cautious yet profitable and start truly innovating and harnessing the creativity that's always existed in the company to win back the market share that they've lost over the years.